6 months from now, you could be living inside the same patterns that have shaped your days for years, waking, working, longing, repeating, or you could be someone you barely recognize in the best possible way. That is the promise and the terror of real transformation. Carl Jung devoted his life to understanding why some people remain trapped in cycles of frustration and despair, while others, often within a surprisingly short span of time, emerge fundamentally changed. He called the process individuation, the unfolding of the psyche into its fullest, truest form. And unlike the endless self-help rituals and hollow affirmations that fill bookshelves, Jung's discovery was not about layering new habits over old wounds. It was about integration, about turning toward the unconscious, the hidden architecture of the self, and allowing it to complete the work it is already trying to do. Most people misunderstand change. They believe it happens gradually, inch by inch, with slow effort stretched across years. But Jung saw again and again that true psychological transformation happens in leaps, in moments when the unconscious breaks through and reorganizes the entire personality. These moments are not random. They arrive when a person reaches certain thresholds. If you work with these thresholds rather than resist them, 6 months can remake a life. If you ignore them, the next 6 months will pass as all the others have, leaving you stuck in the same patterns you thought you'd left behind. Consider the familiar cycle: you quit a toxic job only to find yourself suffocating in the same dynamics at the next one. You walk away from a dysfunctional relationship, and somehow, as if drawn by invisible threads, you attract the same type of person in a different body. You uproot your life and move to another city, yet within months, the old frustrations seep back in as though they had followed you across the map. Jung observed this constantly. People rearranged their circumstances but carried the same internal blueprint into every new situation. And because the unconscious governs most of our lives, they ended up recreating the very conditions they were desperate to escape. Here lies Jung's revolutionary insight: you cannot change your life by changing its surface. You change your life by changing your relationship with the unconscious. Until you do, you remain a puppet mistaking the strings for your own choices. Yet those strings are not malicious. The unconscious does not want you to remain stuck. On the contrary, it is actively trying to transform you. The repeated patterns you call failures are not punishments, but messages. The symptoms you resent, your anxiety, your frustration, your recurring grief, are not problems to eliminate, but signals that your psyche is straining toward wholeness. The choice is stark and unavoidable. Spend the next 6 months fighting your unconscious or begin working with it. That choice alone determines whether you remain a prisoner of old patterns or awaken into a new self. As Jung warned, you cannot change what you cannot see. Which is why the beginning of transformation is not about action, but about awareness. The first phase of the process is a confrontation with what Jung called the shadow. The parts of yourself you exiled long ago in order to be accepted, praised, or simply survive. You buried your anger in the name of being agreeable, your ambition in the name of humility, your sensitivity in the name of strength. Every trait you disowned did not vanish. It slipped into the shadow, and from there, it has been directing your life from behind the curtain. Jung taught his patients to spend the first 2 months not trying to fix themselves, but mapping their shadows, turning the invisible visible. The method is disarmingly simple, yet profoundly destabilizing. For 60 days, you pay close attention to your triggers. Every time someone enrages you, disgusts you, or sparks irrational emotion, you record it. The arrogant colleague, the needy friend, the selfish sibling, Jung would tell you these people are not simply who they appear. They are mirrors. The arrogance that makes your blood boil may in fact be your own disowned confidence trying to return. The neediness that repels you may reflect your own rejected vulnerability. The selfishness you condemn may be the echo of your abandoned right to care for yourself. In the same way, the qualities you admire in others, courage, creativity, brilliance, may represent your golden shadow, the potential you have projected outward because you cannot yet accept it within. One of Jung's patients, after months of tracking, realized that his lifelong contempt for weakness had nothing to do with others at all. What he called weakness was actually strength, the courage to be vulnerable, something he had buried so deeply that it appeared grotesque to him when embodied by others. By mapping his triggers, he discovered not the flaws of others, but the abandoned corners of himself. For these 2 months, nothing is forced. You are not changing behavior or imposing discipline. You are gathering a psychological inventory of all the qualities you left behind. Jung believed that simply seeing the shadow with clarity begins to loosen its grip. Awareness alone is a form of liberation, and by the end of this mapping, you hold in your hands a chart of your unconscious material, the projections, the suppressions, the patterns that have silently orchestrated your life. Yet, seeing the shadow is only the beginning. The deeper work begins once you turn toward these exiled parts with the radical act of dialogue. Jung's method of active imagination teaches you to converse with your shadow not as an enemy, but as a neglected ally. In this dialogue, anger may appear as a warrior demanding the right to defend you, or selfishness may appear as a guardian insisting you deserve care. What you once feared as flaws begin to reveal themselves as the very qualities you need for wholeness. The dialogue with the shadow is not an intellectual exercise, but a living encounter. Jung himself practiced it and described how his rejected aggression, which he once feared might erupt destructively, revealed itself in imagination as a force of protection. It was not trying to make him cruel, it was trying to give him the ability to establish boundaries. Likewise, a patient who had spent her entire life pleasing others discovered through these inner conversations a fierce protector she had buried since childhood. That protector was not mean or heartless. It was the part of her that knew how to say no, how to guard her energy, how to claim her own worth. Once she allowed it back into her life, she did not become selfish. She became whole. This is the heart of months 3 and 4 integration. To integrate the shadow is not to act out its impulses blindly, nor to suppress them further. It is to welcome them back into the circle of the self and give them their rightful place. Jung insisted that the unconscious is not a swamp of darkness, but a reservoir of vitality. Every trait you have rejected carries energy, creativity, and guidance. The very qualities you disown to survive are the ones that, when reclaimed, allow you to thrive. Integration begins in imagination, but does not stay there. The next step is to express these qualities in small, conscious ways. The person who exiled anger begins practicing calm but firm boundary setting. The one who buried ambition takes a concrete step toward a neglected goal. The individual who denied sensitivity allows themselves moments of vulnerability without shame. These are not dramatic gestures. They are deliberate acts that reintroduce the missing parts of the psyche into daily life. Every time you do, you retrieve power that was trapped in exile. You stop sabotaging yourself with unconscious impulses, because those impulses no longer need to operate from the shadows. By the close of the 4th month, many people find themselves astonished at how different they feel. They have more energy, clearer perception, and a sense of being less fragmented. For some, it feels like meeting themselves again after decades of absence. Yet Jung warned that this stage, as liberating as it is only preparation. The real transformation begins when the ego itself is challenged, when the structure of who you thought you were can no longer contain all the reclaimed material. This is where months 5 and 6 lead into the crucible of identity. Jung described this stage as the activation of the transcendent function, the moment when the conscious and unconscious stop opposing each other and begin to collaborate. But before that union can occur, the ego must loosen its grip. The false self, the carefully constructed mask that has held you together, begins to crack. This is terrifying. The old ways of responding no longer fit, but the new ways are not yet solid. It feels as though you are living between worlds, unable to retreat and not yet able to advance. One patient described this stage as walking through every interaction with 2 voices inside her. The old self, urging her to smooth things over, to please, to retreat, while the new self whispered about boundaries, honesty, and authenticity. She held both impulses without collapsing into either, and the tension was almost unbearable. Jung compared it to pregnancy. You are carrying a new self inside you, and the pressure grows each day until something must give. This is the death of the ego, not a literal death, but a dissolution of the rigid identity that kept you safe but limited. To sit in this tension without fleeing is the hardest part of the process. Many turn back here. They sense that once the old self dies, there is no returning, and the ego panics. Life may begin to unravel. Relationships built on your old patterns start to crumble. Jobs that suited your false self become intolerable. Everything built on shaky foundations starts collapsing. Jung called this the night sea journey, the descent into darkness that precedes rebirth. Yet within this dissolution lies the miracle. If you can endure the pressure without retreating, the psyche generates a new organizing principle. A self, not the ego, begins to emerge. It is not an improved version of your old personality. It is a deeper center, a place from which you can live without the constant pull of projection and suppression. In this new center, you are not driven by what others expect, nor by the old scripts of survival. You are guided by something essential, something that feels at once unfamiliar and utterly your own. The shift can arrive suddenly. One morning you realize you no longer react to old triggers. A situation that would have thrown you into panic or rage passes over you like a wave that no longer finds purchase. The patterns that held you captive for years dissolve not through force, but through the simple fact that they no longer belong to who you are. Jung himself captured this moment when he wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But the choice is no longer an act of willpower. It arises naturally from the self that has emerged. This is the crystallization of transformation. It is not gradual improvement, it is birth. By the end of 6 months, if you have followed the path of mapping, integrating, and enduring the death of the ego, you stand as someone different at a cellular level. The old life feels like a dream. You can no longer re-enter clothes that no longer fit, no matter how you tug at the seams. As profound as this rebirth is, Jung emphasized that it does not unfold in isolation. Throughout the 6 months, 2 daily practices serve as threads connecting you to the deeper process, dream work, and synchronicity tracking. These are not esoteric rituals, but psychological technologies that keep you in conversation with the unconscious as it reshapes your inner world. Every morning before the noise of the day has a chance to scatter your awareness, you write down your dreams. You do not analyze them with cold logic or dismiss them as meaningless fragments. Instead, you approach them as messages from the unconscious, communications coded in symbol and story. Jung discovered that as people progress through this 6-month journey, their dream landscapes change dramatically. In the beginning, dreams often feature pursuit, being chased by figures that represent disowned aspects of the self. As the months pass, these figures transform into companions or opponents you must confront. Later images of death and birth dominate, signaling the ego's dissolution and the self's emergence. Finally, by the 6th month, dreams often involve arrival, new landscapes, new dwellings, journeys completed. These dreams are not just passive reflections. Through active imagination, you can re-enter them, converse with their figures, and alter their outcomes. A nightmare of being pursued can become an encounter in which you turn to face the pursuer and ask why it has come. A dream of loss can reveal itself as a dream of release. In this way, your dream life becomes a parallel stage where transformation rehearses itself each night, offering you insights and guidance that conscious thought cannot provide. Alongside dream synchronicities provide another map of the unconscious at work. These are meaningful coincidences, events that carry a weight disproportionate to chance. The book that falls open to the page, you needed the stranger who offers exactly the words you were longing to hear, the opportunity that appears, just as you dared to envision it. Jung believed these were not random. They were evidence that the unconscious, once engaged, begins to shape the field of your external reality as well. Patients who tracked these synchronicities often found them multiplying as their process deepened. What began as rare moments of uncanny alignment became daily occurrences, as though the world itself were conspiring to mirror their inner transformation. One man who followed Jung's protocol documented this carefully. In the first month, he noted only 1 or 2 coincidences that felt significant. By the 6th month, he was experiencing several each day, from chance meetings to uncanny symbols appearing in his environment. The effect was not merely mystical. It reinforced the sense that his transformation was not confined to his psyche, but rippling outward, reorganizing the texture of his entire life. Synchronicities like dreams remind you that the unconscious is not a private chamber, but a living force woven into reality itself. But perhaps the most unsettling truth Jung uncovered is that by the 4th month, the process becomes irreversible. Once you have truly begun to map and integrate the shadow, once the cracks in the ego have opened, you cannot go back to your former self, no matter how much you long for the comfort of the familiar. Many sense this point of no return approaching in panic. The ego, realizing its control is slipping, throws up every obstacle it can. Crisis erupts, old addictions flare, relationships destabilize. You may feel as though your life is crumbling just when you most need stability. Yet Jung would insist this is not failure. This is the necessary collapse of structures that no longer align with your emerging self. The night sea journey, that passage through darkness, is not optional. It is the crucible in which the old life dissolves. A woman who crossed this threshold described waking one day and finding that she could no longer remember how to perform her old roles. It was not that she resisted them, it was that they were gone, like a language she had once spoken fluently and now could not recall. Trying to return was as futile as trying to wear the clothes of childhood. They no longer fit, and they never would again. To many, this sounds terrifying, but Jung saw it as the greatest gift of individuation. Once the false self begins to die, the process carries itself forward. You do not need to force transformation. You need only not to abandon it. The unconscious, once engaged, will complete the work. This is why he urged his patients to persist through the discomfort, to resist the temptation to sabotage their progress when the pressure grew unbearable. Because on the other side of the night sea journey waits not an improved ego, but the birth of the self. By the final stretch of the journey, something extraordinary occurs. The self begins to crystallize, not as a polished version of your old personality, but as an entirely new center of being. It feels less like adding layers and more like shedding them, until what remains is startlingly authentic, as though you are meeting yourself for the very first time. Situations that once ensnared you in old reactions lose their grip. The toxic job no longer lures you into silent compliance. You can see the dynamic clearly and step outside it. The dysfunctional relationship no longer seduces you with familiar drama. You recognize it as a mirror of patterns you have already integrated. Even your thoughts shift, less dictated by fear or obligation, and more by an inner compass that feels steady, unmistakable, and deeply your own. What emerges here is what Jung called the self with a capital S. It is not a role, not a mask, not a temporary identity, but a principle of wholeness that organizes your psyche around authenticity rather than survival. This is why the transformation feels so sudden, almost cellular. You are no longer negotiating between fragments of yourself or constantly battling disowned parts. You are unified, and that unity brings a profound sense of calm strength. It does not mean life becomes free of pain or challenge. It means the endless repetition of old wounds, the cyclical traps that once consumed you, have lost their power. Jung described this emergence as both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it demands the complete death of the old self. Liberating because once the self has emerged, it cannot be undone. You cannot unsee what you now see. You cannot unknow who you truly are. The habits and roles that once defined you fall away like discarded costumes. What remains is not the person you thought you had to become, but the person you always were beneath the noise. Throughout history, mystics and sages have described such transformations as rebirths. Jung's genius was to map a psychological process that could make such rebirths available in modern life without myth or dogma. He showed that you do not need perfect conditions, decades of meditation, or dramatic external upheavals. 6 months of sustained work with the unconscious, mapping, dialoguing, integrating, enduring, can produce irreversible change. The clock does not start when circumstances align. It starts when you choose to face yourself. Yet he also warned that most people avoid this path. The discomfort of the early months, the destabilization of integration, the terror of ego death, these drive many back into the arms of old patterns. They would rather rearrange external circumstances, endlessly chasing new jobs, partners, or locations, than face the truth that they themselves must change. Jung saw this as the great tragedy of human life, that so many die without ever meeting who they really are. They live as fragments, as masks, as echoes of cultural expectation. Individuation. The birth of the self is the destiny few are willing to claim, but for those who do, the reward is immeasurable. One woman who completed the process said it felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. She did not become perfect, nor did she erase her history. Instead, she felt anchored in something larger than her wounds, something that gave meaning even to her pain. Another man said that the constant background noise of his life, the anxiety, the nagging dissatisfaction simply disappeared, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he no longer lived at war with himself. This is the promise of Jung's 6-month protocol, not improvement, but transformation. Not the pursuit of a better life, but the discovery of a real life, your life unmasked and unfragmented. The path is not easy. It requires discomfort, honesty, and a willingness to let go of everything you thought you were. But once crossed, it does not fade. Once the self has been born, it remains. The 6 months pass whether you choose them or not. The question is whether you will allow them to pass unchanged, repeating the same cycles, or whether you will step into the work and emerge as someone you can scarcely remember not being. If you are listening to this and feel the pull, do not dismiss it. The unconscious is already calling. Your dreams, your triggers, your repeating patterns are invitations to begin. You do not need to wait for the perfect moment. You need only the willingness to turn inward, to map your shadow, to dialogue with it, to endure the death of the false self, so the true self can emerge. The work is difficult, but the reward is permanent. So as you leave this reflection, remember the next 6 months are going to pass anyway. Whether they leave you unchanged or transform you entirely depends on whether you accept the invitation Jung placed before us all. If this spoke to you, if you sense that something inside you is ready for more, then take the first step today. Write down your dreams, notice your triggers, begin the dialogue. Transformation is not waiting in the distance, it is waiting within you. If this journey resonates, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe to the channel for more deep explorations of Jung's insights, and comment below with what part of this process speaks to you most. Your reflections may spark transformation in someone else.